Hello and welcome to this video on one thing that everyone seems to want to try at some point and that nobody really should. Using Bakers yeast for brewing. After all, everyone knows yeast is yeast, right? With so many varieties of dedicated brewing yeast strains available, you might be at a loss as to where the beginning is. Do you really need that high alcohol tolerant variety? What are specialty ale yeast? Is lager yeast so different from that stuff in the supermarket? Can't you just substitute one for the other? The answer to everything so far is yes, but with some rather large caveats. The reasons are simple. Each is unique to the purpose it has been developed for. While there is some overlap, there are also big differences, and we've spoken about these in another video that you can find in the top right corner of this video. Using the right yeast is important. This is all the more true when you consider that Brewers yeast can cost twice as much as Bakers yeast for far less. This leads to the use of Bakers yeast. Unlike brewing yeast, Bakers yeast is meant to live in an aerobic environment and convert flour into carbon dioxide, which causes bread to leaven. This purpose and mechanism is important. Generally, it always leads to a light, fluffy loaf of bread. That leads to the conversion of starch into glucose, and this makes the bread slightly sweeter and enjoyable to eat. It also ensures that the energy contained within it is more or less readily convertible into energy for the human body. This does not mean you cannot use Bakers yeast to brew. The process of generating that CO2 to leaven the bread is the same process used during fermentation. The important thing to remember when doing this is that you need to account for the flavors, alcohol tolerance, and substrate you are fermenting. Bakers yeast can be used for brewing. The problem you will find is that it creates a very bitter taste. This is because it is not meant for brewing. The effect can be mitigated by the use of large concentrations of sugar. This will counter the bitter flavor with sweet flavors of residual sugars. The bitterness stems from a few factors. One of these is dissolved CO2 in whatever you're trying to ferment. Others include byproduct flavors that are otherwise unnoticeable in bread, depending on which particular variety you're making. In other cases, you might want to make something like, say, a sourdough, and that will leave a notable sour taste. But much of that comes from lactic acid generated by the lactobacillus within sourdough. The sweetness of bread and the residual sweetness of a fermentation is a result of the much lower tolerance of Bakers yeast to ethanol. While you can easily get up to 20% alcohol by volume with distilling yeast, 12 to 15% with lager yeast, and 8 to 10% with ale yeast, Bakers yeast will struggle to push 80% alcohol by volume. This is because so little of the sugar is converted into alcohol, and this is good in two ways. One, it means that you have a much sweeter brew, and this is why it will taste sweet if you add enough sugar. That covers up some of those unpleasant flavors. The other upside to this, if you want to view it that way, is that it isn't as alcoholic. The downside to it is if you're trying to brew, say, moonshine or an ethanol wash, you won't get that high alcohol concentration, and this is a big consideration for anyone looking to use it. Application will be key. Something like a high ethanol wash simply won't work. There is also the flavor. In this case, not the off flavors, but the flavors that a dedicated, specialized yeast strain brings. There is a reason why so many varieties of yeast exist. Each has its own flavor profile that is generated when fermenting in a dedicated and often customized environment. You will not get this with Bakers yeast. In fact, you'll often get much of the opposite effect. Those flavors that would make a particular variety of beer, for instance, with its complex and carefully crafted selection of sugars, malts, and similar, will go to waste, simply because the yeast is not going to ferment it in the right ways, the right ratios, and create the right byproducts for the right flavors. This leads us to the final consideration. Baker's yeast is not as well adapted to a liquid environment. Where bread and other baked goods are largely a solid, brewing is a liquid environment and the shock may delay your baker's yeast. If you are basing your timelines on a quick and effective fermentation, you should add several days as your baker's yeast will need time to adapt to this different environment and proliferate to the same population level as it was before you added it to the fermentation. It will then still need more time to continue growing afterwards. This same shock is going to delay its fermentation and adversely affect it, slowing it down and making it work less effectively, even if you have more yeast over time. All of this is not to say that you can't use baker's yeast. It is a great way to get started with brewing, especially for children if you want to introduce them to the concept of microbes, converting products between states, for example, taking your substrates of sugar, turning them into ethanol and into CO2. You can create very simple but very effective ginger beer recipes, for example. These can use baker's yeast. Unlike the more nuanced flavors of beer, cider, and wine, this often has a strong and almost overwhelming flavor that covers the off tastes generated by baker's yeast. Further to that, the amount of alcohol generated because it's baker's yeast and not a fermenting yeast intended for brewing will be almost negligible if done correctly. This makes an experimental demonstration like this entirely suitable for children, safe for schools, and so on. You can also begin to expand the concept out from simply saying, here is an example where you have a generic yeast used for baking, and then explain, as we have so far in this video, why that differs from other yeast varieties. It's also useful if you simply want something that is all-purpose. For example, if you only occasionally want something interesting to drink, and the rest of the time you want to be able to make bread, baker's yeast will work. As you can see, baker's yeast can be used to brew, but it carries some very obvious and significant drawbacks. That does not mean in a pinch or for beginners it might not be useful as a way to test how well a given recipe or test sample of a wash can ferment, but you do need to take any lessons drawn from it with a very large grain of salt, as they won't always translate the right way. Thank you for watching. If you found this interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.